The sun beat down on Rosewood Heights that Tuesday afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually was during work hours. Most driveways sat empty, with residents away at their jobs in the city. Patricia Miller stood at her living room window, peering through the blinds. She had lived in this upscale community for 15 years and considered herself its unofficial guardian. Her neighbors often joked about her vigilance, but Patricia took pride in keeping Rosewood safe, as she put it. Today, something caught her attention. A dark blue sedan had been parked across the street for nearly 20 minutes. The car wasn't from the neighborhood. Patricia prided herself on knowing every vehicle that belonged on her block. Inside the car sat Robert Taylor, a 52-year-old Air Force veteran with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that had seen too much during his 3 tours overseas. He checked his watch again and sighed. His old buddy Mike was running late, as usual. Robert had driven an hour to meet him, and now he was stuck waiting in the car. Just 5 more minutes, he muttered to himself, scrolling through his phone to pass the time. His son had sent him several pictures of his new office at the hospital. Robert smiled with pride as he looked at them. Patricia's suspicion grew with each passing minute. Who was this man? What was he doing in their neighborhood? She had built her sense of safety on knowing everyone who belonged, and in her mind, this stranger clearly didn't. She grabbed her phone and house keys, deciding to investigate. The neighborhood watch meeting last month had emphasized, if you see something, say something. Patricia took these words to heart, perhaps too literally. She marched across the street, her tennis shoes slapping against the pavement. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the righteousness she felt in confronting this intruder. Robert looked up from his phone to see a middle-aged white woman approaching his car, her face twisted in a scowl. He had experienced this before. The familiar weight of dread settled in his stomach as he put his phone down and prepared for what was coming. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" Patricia's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet afternoon air. Robert rolled down his window. His voice remained steady, calm. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm waiting for my friend Mike Chen. He lives at number 47. He gestured toward the house behind her. He should be home any minute now." Patricia crossed her arms. "Mike Chen? I know everyone on this street, and there's no Mike Chen here. He moved in about 3 months ago," Robert explained patiently. "I'm just waiting for him to get home from work." But Patricia wasn't listening. In her mind, she had already decided who Robert was and why he was there. The expensive houses in Rosewood Heights had been targeted by burglars last summer. Despite all evidence pointing to a ring of professional thieves who had since been caught, Patricia remained convinced that the neighborhood was under constant threat. "I'm going to need you to leave," she demanded, pulling out her phone, "or I'm calling the police." "Ma'am, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm simply waiting for my friend." Patricia's face reddened. "Don't give me that. I know what you're really doing here." Robert had faced this kind of baseless accusation before. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I understand you're concerned, but there's really no need to. Get out of our neighborhood." Patricia's voice rose to a shout. A few neighbors peeked out their windows, drawn by the commotion. Robert noticed and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. After serving his country for decades, after working his way up to a respected position at the Pentagon, he was still being treated like a criminal simply for existing in the wrong space. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said softly. Something in his gentle tone seemed to enrage Patricia further. Perhaps it was the contrast to her own hostility, making her feel foolish. Perhaps it was his refusal to be intimidated. Whatever the reason, something inside her snapped. Before Robert could react, Patricia's hand shot through the open window and her fist connected with his cheek. The shock of it froze them both for a split second. Then a voice called out from across the street. "Hey, what are you doing? I'm calling the police." A young woman had witnessed everything from her porch. She already had her phone out, camera recording. Patricia stepped back, suddenly aware of what she had done. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the consequences were just beginning. The wail of police sirens broke the afternoon quiet. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing against the neat row of houses. Robert sat on the edge of his car seat, holding a small bag of ice against his cheek that a kind neighbor had brought over. The skin beneath the ice was already turning purple. Officer Wilson approached him first, "Sir, are you all right?" Robert nodded slowly. "I've been better." His voice remained steady despite the throbbing pain in his face. "Can you tell me what happened here?" The officer pulled out a small notebook. Robert explained everything simply, without dramatic flair or anger. He described waiting for his friend, Patricia's approach, and the sudden punch through his car window. His military background showed in how he reported the facts, clear, concise, chronological. "I didn't raise my voice or my hands," he finished. "I just wanted to wait for my buddy in peace." Across the street, Patricia was telling a very different story to Officer Chen. Her hands flew in wild gestures as she spoke. "He was casing the houses. I know he was. We've had break-ins before, and I was protecting my neighborhood." "Ma'am, did he threaten you in any way?" Officer Chen asked, keeping his voice even. "Well, no, but—" "Did he attempt to exit his vehicle?" "No, but his presence was threatening. He doesn't belong here." Officer Chen raised an eyebrow, and that justified punching him. Patricia's face flushed red. "You don't understand. He was what, ma'am?" She couldn't finish the sentence, at least not with the words she wanted to use. Not with the young woman still recording everything on her phone from her porch. The officers conferred briefly before returning to Patricia. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to turn around. You're under arrest for assault." "What? You're arresting me?" Patricia's voice rose to a shriek. "What about him? Why was he here?" "He was waiting for his friend, who just arrived," Officer Wilson said, nodding toward a man hurrying up the street looking confused. "And even if he wasn't, sitting in a car is not a crime. Punching someone is." As the officers placed handcuffs on Patricia's wrists, reading her rights, Mike finally reached Robert's car. "Rob, what happened to your face?" Mike looked horrified. "Just a misunderstanding," Robert said quietly. "Your neighbor thought I didn't belong here." Mike's expression hardened as he watched Patricia being led to the police car. "This is exactly why I wanted to move out of this neighborhood. Second incident this year." As the officers helped Patricia into the back seat, she suddenly realized how badly she had misjudged the situation. The man she had attacked wasn't just some random stranger, he was the friend of her new neighbor, exactly as he claimed. "Wait, I made a mistake," she called out. "I was just trying to protect my home." But the door closed, sealing her words inside the patrol car. Back by his car, Robert pressed the ice pack more firmly against his cheek. One of the officers returned to take his official statement. "Sir, we'll need some information from you. Name and occupation." "Robert Taylor. I work at the Pentagon, Department of Defense." The officer paused in his writing, looking up with surprise. "The Pentagon? What's your position there?" "Deputy Director of Strategic Operations," Robert replied without pride or emphasis. "I'm in town just for the weekend to visit old friends." The officer's eyes widened slightly. He'd just taken a statement from someone who helped run military operations for the entire country, someone who'd been treated like a criminal for sitting in his car. Meanwhile, in the back of the police car, Patricia watched through the window as officers treated Robert with growing respect. The realization of what she had done, and who she had done it to, was beginning to sink in. Her stomach churned with the first hints of shame. As the police car pulled away, she caught a glimpse of more neighbors coming outside, talking, pointing. Some had phones out, undoubtedly sharing what they'd witnessed on social media. By tonight, everyone would know what Patricia Miller had done. And by tomorrow, the whole world might know too. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire, millions of views, thousands of comments, and one name trending across all platforms, Patricia Miller. The neighbor's recording captured everything: Patricia's accusations, a sudden punch, Robert's stunned expression, and finally her arrest. The local news picked up the story first. Pentagon official assaulted in suburban neighborhood flashed across TV screens. Robert's calm demeanor during his brief interview only made Patricia look worse. "I don't hold any ill will," Robert told reporters outside the police station. "But we need to ask ourselves why someone's first reaction to seeing me was fear and anger." Patricia sat in her kitchen, phone ringing nonstop. Friends calling to check if she'd seen the news. Family members asking what on earth she'd been thinking. Her boss leaving messages about an urgent discussion regarding recent events. She hadn't slept all night. After being released on bail, she'd come home to find her social media flooded with hateful messages. Someone had posted her address online. Another person had called her workplace. "This can't be happening," she whispered, closing the blinds when she spotted a news van pulling up outside. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Have you seen who he really is? They're talking about it on TV right now." Patricia switched on the television to see Robert's face on screen. Not just his face, his entire life story was being shared. Childhood in a small town, 22 years of military service, Bronze Star recipient, Harvard graduate, father of 2 accomplished children. The news anchor's voice was filled with respect. "Mr. Taylor has received numerous commendations for bravery during his military career, including saving 4 fellow soldiers during an ambush in 2003. Photos flashed across the screen. Robert in his military uniform, Robert receiving medals, Robert at the Pentagon. Currently serving as Deputy Director of Strategic Operations at the Pentagon, Mr. Taylor oversees critical defense initiatives and has been described by colleagues as one of the finest minds in national security." Patricia felt sick. She had punched a war hero, a high-ranking government official, someone who had risked his life for the country multiple times. Her phone rang again, her lawyer this time. "Patricia, we need to talk about the charges. The prosecutor is pushing for hate crime enhancements." "Hate crime?" Patricia's voice cracked. "But I'm not racist. I was just worried about." "They have witnesses who say you used racial slurs during the incident." Patricia fell silent. Has she? She couldn't even remember exactly what she'd said in the heat of the moment. The thought terrified her. Outside, the number of news vans had grown to 3. A reporter was talking to her next-door neighbor. She silenced her phone and curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket over herself as if it could shield her from what was happening. Her eyes drifted back to the TV where a panel was now discussing the broader implications of the incident. "This isn't just about one woman's actions," a commentator was saying. "It's about the assumptions we make based on appearance alone. Mr. Taylor's distinguished career serving this country didn't protect him from being seen as a threat simply for existing in a space where someone decided he didn't belong." The camera cut to another analyst. "We should note that Mr. Taylor has handled this with remarkable grace. Many in his position might have demanded the harshest possible punishment, but he stated he's more interested in this becoming a learning moment." Patricia couldn't watch anymore. She turned off the TV, but the silence felt worse. In that quiet, she had to face her own thoughts, her own actions. A notification sound made her jump. Reluctantly, she checked her phone to find an email from her company's HR department. "In light of recent events that conflict with our company values, we are placing you on immediate administrative leave pending investigation." Patricia let the phone drop from her hand. In just 24 hours, her entire life was unraveling. Her reputation destroyed. Her job in jeopardy. Possibly even criminal charges that could follow her forever. All because of split-second assumptions and uncontrolled anger directed at a man whose only crime was waiting for a friend while being black. She buried her face in her hands. The worst part wasn't even the public shame or legal trouble. It was having to admit to herself what her actions revealed about who she really was. And she had no idea how she could ever make this right. 3 days after the incident, Patricia sat alone in her living room, blinds drawn against the world. The reporters had mostly moved on to fresher stories, but online she was still the villain of the hour. She scrolled through her phone, seeing her face everywhere, usually paired with unflattering screenshots from the viral video. Her lawyer had called earlier. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for next week. He didn't sound optimistic. "I need to see what else they're saying," Patricia muttered to herself, clicking on a news interview with Robert. She hadn't been able to stop watching coverage of the incident, torturing herself with each new development. The interview showed Robert sitting in a well-lit studio, his bruise now a yellowish color against his dark skin. He spoke with the same calm dignity he'd shown during the incident. "I don't want this to be about me," he was saying. "This happens to people who look like me every day, people who don't have cameras recording or prestigious jobs to make others take notice." The interviewer nodded. "Your response has been remarkably measured. Many are praising your restraint, both during the incident and after." Robert shook his head slightly. I shouldn't have to be perfect to be treated with basic human dignity. Patricia felt the words like a punch to her own gut. She'd been telling herself that Robert's impressive background made her actions worse, but that wasn't the point at all. She would have been just as wrong if he'd been unemployed or homeless. The interviewer shifted topics. Your son has also been in the news lately for very different reasons. Dr. Anthony Taylor was recently appointed as the youngest ever head of cardiology at City Memorial Hospital. He must be very proud of you, just as you are of him. Patricia froze, her finger hovering over the screen. Anthony Taylor. The name struck a chord in her memory. Robert smiled on screen. We're proud of each other. Anthony has always been driven to help others. That's why he became a doctor. The program cut to a photo of a handsome young man in a white coat, and Patricia's blood turned to ice. She recognized him instantly. No, she whispered. It can't be. She fumbled for the remote, rewinding the segment to make sure she wasn't mistaken. But there was no doubt. Dr. Anthony Taylor was the same doctor who had performed emergency heart surgery on her father just 2 months ago. Patricia's mind raced back to that terrible night. Her father collapsing at dinner. The frantic ambulance ride. The doctor who had met them in the emergency room, young but confident. I'm Dr. Taylor, he had said. Your father needs immediate surgery, and I'm the best person to perform it. For 12 hours, Patricia and her mother had waited, praying for a miracle. And Dr. Taylor had delivered one, emerging from surgery tired but smiling. We've stabilized him. It was touch and go for a while, but he's going to pull through. Patricia had hugged the doctor, sobbing with gratitude. You saved his life. We can never repay you. Now, staring at the same face on her television screen, Patricia felt the world tilt beneath her. The man she had assaulted was the father of the doctor who had saved her own father's life. Her phone rang, startling her out of her shocked state. It was her mother. Patricia? Aren't you watching the news? That man you. Her mother couldn't finish the sentence. I know, Mom, Patricia whispered. I just realized it too. Dr. Taylor is his son, the doctor who saved your father. How could this happen? Patricia had no answer. The irony was too cruel, too perfect. Her father was alive because of Dr. Taylor's skill and dedication, and how had she repaid that gift? By assaulting his father over nothing. She hung up and rushed to the bathroom, barely making it before she threw up. After, she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the mirror. What have I done? She asked the hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. For days, she had been worried about herself, her reputation, her job, her future. Now, for the first time, she truly saw her actions through someone else's eyes. Not just anyone's eyes, but through the eyes of a man whose son had given her family the precious gift of more time with her father. Patricia slid down to the bathroom floor, her back against the cold tile wall, and did something she hadn't done since the incident. She cried. Not for herself this time, but for the pain she had caused, for the ugliness she had revealed in herself, and for the terrible connection that fate had cruelly woven between her family and Robert Taylor's. The realization was a turning point, more powerful than any public shaming could ever be. This wasn't just about facing consequences anymore. This was about facing herself. The morning light filtered through the blinds as Patricia sat across from her therapist, Dr. Weston. This was their 3rd session in 2 weeks. After the shocking discovery about Dr. Taylor, Patricia had finally admitted she needed help. I keep seeing his face, Patricia said quietly. Not just when I close my eyes, but everywhere. In the grocery store. Driving past me on the street. It's like my brain is trying to remind me of what I did. Dr. Weston nodded. That's your conscience working. Your mind is processing the disconnect between how you've always seen yourself and the actions you took that day. Patricia twisted a tissue in her hands until it shredded. I always thought I was a good person. I donated to charities. I helped my neighbors. I never thought I was. She couldn't finish the sentence. Prejudiced? Dr. Weston supplied gently. Patricia flinched but nodded. How could I not have seen it in myself? Because it doesn't always look like what we expect, Dr. Weston explained. Most people with biases don't walk around thinking hateful thoughts all day. It's more subtle than that. It's the split-second assumptions we make, the different standards we apply without realizing it. Patricia thought back to that afternoon, how quickly she decided Robert was dangerous. Would she have reacted the same way to a white man sitting in a car? "I need to make this right somehow," she whispered, "but I don't know if that's even possible." "What would making it right look like to you?" Dr. Weston asked. Patricia struggled with the question. "I don't think there's anything I can do that erases what happened. But maybe I can learn from it, change who I am going forward." Across town, Robert sat in his friend Mike's living room. His visit, originally planned for just a weekend, had stretched to nearly 2 weeks as he dealt with police statements and media attention. "You should see the letters I'm getting," Robert told Mike, gesturing to his email. "People sharing similar experiences. Parents worried about their black sons driving in certain neighborhoods. Veterans who faced the same thing after serving." Mike shook his head. "Man, I'm still angry on your behalf. I don't know how you are staying so calm about all this." Robert's expression grew serious. "Who says I'm calm inside? I'm furious this happened. But rage doesn't help anyone, especially not me." He touched his cheek, where the bruise had faded but the memory remained sharp. "Besides, this was just one afternoon for me. Others deal with this kind of thing every day of their lives." His phone buzzed with a text from Anthony. "Dad, you okay? Seeing more coverage online. Call me." Robert smiled slightly. His son had called every day since the incident, worried despite Robert's assurances that he was fine. "Anthony's more upset than I am," Robert told Mike. "He keeps saying he wants to come down here, but I told him to stay put. The hospital needs him." "How's he handling the connection to that woman's father?" "That's some cosmic joke, huh?" Robert shrugged. "He says it doesn't change anything. He took an oath to help everyone, regardless of who they are." Pride warmed his voice. That's the kind of man he is. Meanwhile, at City Memorial Hospital, Dr. Anthony Taylor was finishing his rounds when a nurse approached him. "Dr. Taylor, there's someone asking to speak with you. Says it's personal, not medical." She lowered her voice. "It's about your father." Anthony tensed. Since the incident, he'd received numerous interview requests and even a few hate messages from people who somehow blamed him for what happened to his father. "Who is it?" he asked. "An older gentleman. Says his name is Harold Miller." Anthony froze. Miller, the same last name as the woman who had assaulted his father. Against his better judgment, he agreed to take the meeting in his office. The man who entered was stooped with age, moving slowly with a cane. Anthony recognized him immediately. The emergency heart patient from 2 months ago. "Mr. Miller," Anthony said, professional but cautious. "How can I help you?" The old man's eyes were red-rimmed. "I came to apologize for what my daughter did to your father. I just found out yesterday." His voice cracked. "I've been sick, and they kept it from me, afraid the stress would be too much." Anthony gestured for him to sit. "Sir, you're not responsible for your daughter's actions." "But I am," Harold insisted. "Somehow I raised her to think that way. And now to learn that she did this to the father of the man who saved my life." Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks. "I owe my life to you. And this is how my family repays that gift." Anthony felt his professional detachment slipping. This wasn't just a patient anymore. This was the father of the woman who had made his own father a viral video, a news story, a talking point. "Your daughter made a terrible mistake," Anthony said finally. "But what matters now is what she learns from it. What we all learn from it." Harold nodded, wiping his eyes. "She's changed since it happened. Something broke in her. But maybe that needed to break so something better could grow." The words lingered in the air between them. A tentative bridge across a painful divide. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and onlookers. Patricia clutched her lawyer's arm as they pushed through the crowd. Camera flashes popped like lightning. Voices called out questions she had no intention of answering. "Look straight ahead," her lawyer murmured. "Don't engage with anyone." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations that fell silent as Patricia entered. She felt eyes tracking her every move as she made her way to her seat. The wooden bench felt hard and unforgiving beneath her. This was the day she'd been dreading for weeks. The day she would formally face the consequences of those few seconds of rage that had changed everything. Her lawyer had explained the options carefully. Fighting the charges would mean a public trial, more media attention, and likely a harsher sentence if convicted. Taking a plea deal meant admitting guilt but potentially avoiding jail time. The prosecution is offering community service, anger management classes, and a restorative justice program, he told her. Given the evidence against you, it's the best outcome we can hope for. Patricia had agreed immediately, not just because it was the practical choice, but because it felt right. She was guilty. She had done what they accused her of. The video didn't lie. The courtroom doors opened again, and Patricia's heart skipped when Robert Taylor walked in. He moved with quiet dignity, nodding to his lawyer as he took a seat. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Patricia quickly looked down, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Powell was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "We're here today in the case of the state versus Patricia Miller," she announced, her voice filling the courtroom. "I understand a plea agreement has been reached." The proceedings moved quickly after that. Patricia listened as the charges were read. Assault with a bias enhancement. Her lawyer confirmed she was pleading guilty. The prosecutor outlined the terms of the agreement. Then came the moment Patricia had been preparing for. Judge Powell looked directly at her. "Ms. Miller, before I accept this plea, I'd like to hear from you. Do you understand the charges against you and the consequences of your plea?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia said, her voice barely audible. "And would you like to make a statement to the court?" Patricia stood slowly, her knees trembling. She had written and rewritten her statement dozens of times, working with both her lawyer and her therapist to find the right words. But now, facing the moment of truth, she set aside her prepared remarks. She turned to face Robert directly. "Mr. Taylor," she began, her voice shaking, "there's nothing I can say that excuses what I did to you. I acted on assumptions and fear that I didn't even recognize in myself until now." She paused, fighting back tears. "When I discovered that your son was the doctor who saved my father's life, it hit me hard. Not because it made what I did worse. What I did was already inexcusable, but because it forced me to see the humanity I had denied you." The courtroom was completely silent now. "I've spent these weeks thinking about how differently I might have acted if I'd known who you were. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? That I might have treated you better if I'd known about your job or your son. The truth is, it shouldn't matter who you are or what you do. You deserved basic respect simply as a human being, and I failed to give you that." Patricia wiped a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "I'm ashamed of what I did. I'm ashamed of what it revealed about me. I'm taking this plea because I am guilty, and I want to do whatever I can to make amends. Though I know nothing truly erases what happened." She looked back at the judge. "I'll complete every requirement of this agreement, but my real work is changing who I am and how I see the world. That's a lifetime commitment, not just court-ordered classes." Judge Powell nodded slightly, then turned to Robert. "Mr. Taylor, would you like to address the court?" Robert stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked directly at Patricia for a long moment before speaking. "Your Honor, what happened that day was unfortunately not unusual. Many people who look like me have similar stories, though most don't end up in courtrooms with lawyers and plea deals." His deep voice carried effortlessly through the room. "I don't harbor personal hatred toward Ms. Miller. What she did was wrong, but if every person who made assumptions about me based on my skin color was put on trial, we'd need a lot more courthouses." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. "I support this plea agreement, particularly the restorative justice component. This isn't about punishment. It's about growth and change. And not just for Ms. Miller." He gestured toward the reporters in the back. "The attention this case has received means many people are watching, thinking about their own biases, their own assumptions. If something positive comes from this painful experience, let it be that moment of reflection." The judge thanked him and turned back to the matter at hand. She accepted the plea agreement, formally sentencing Patricia to 200 hours of community service, 26 weeks of anger management, and participation in a restorative justice program. Additionally, she ordered Patricia to write a formal letter of apology. As the gavel came down, Patricia felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. The legal process was nearly over, but her journey was just beginning. 6 months passed. The seasons changed, leaves fell, snow came and went, and tiny green buds appeared on the trees again. Life moved on, as it always does, but nothing was the same for Patricia Miller. She parked her car outside the Veterans Support Center, gathering her thoughts before heading in for her shift. This place had become a central part of her life over the past months. What had started as court-ordered community service had evolved into something much more meaningful. Inside, the center hummed with activity. A group of older veterans played cards in one corner while a younger group worked on resumes with job counselors. Patricia hung up her coat and checked in with the front desk. "Morning, Trish," called Donna, the center coordinator. "Coffee's fresh, and the new craft supplies for the PTSD therapy group arrived if you want to help unpack them." Patricia nodded, grateful for the warm welcome she still didn't feel she deserved. Early on, some of the veterans had recognized her from the news. There had been whispers, sideways glances. But over time, as they saw her genuine commitment to the work, most had accepted her presence. She poured herself a cup of coffee and headed to the storage room. As she sorted through boxes of art supplies, her mind drifted back over the past 6 months. The anger management classes had been tough at first, forcing her to confront the ugly truths about herself, the hair-trigger reactions she'd never acknowledged. The restorative justice program had been even harder, sitting in a room with people who had experienced racial profiling and discrimination, listening to their stories, feeling their pain. Some days she'd come home and cried for hours. Other days she'd felt angry all over again, not at Robert or others, but at herself, at the society that had shaped her thinking without her even realizing it. Her old friends had mostly drifted away. Her job had eventually taken her back, but in a different position, away from public view. Her neighbors were civil but distant. The world had moved on to new outrages, new viral videos, new villains of the week. But Patricia carried the weight of what she'd done every day. The sound of voices in the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. Donna was giving someone a tour of the facility. Patricia continued unpacking supplies, half listening to the standard introduction Donna gave all visitors. "And this is our art therapy room," Donna was saying. "We've found creative expression can be incredibly healing for veterans dealing with trauma." "It's an impressive operation you have here," replied a familiar deep voice that made Patricia freeze in place, a handful of paintbrushes suspended in midair. She would know that voice anywhere. It had echoed in her dreams for months. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the doorway and found herself face to face with Robert Taylor. He looked different in casual clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks instead of the suit he'd worn in court. Beside him stood a younger man Patricia immediately recognized as Dr. Anthony Taylor. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met. Patricia felt her heart hammering in her chest. Donna, oblivious to the history between them, smiled brightly. "Oh, good. Patricia, these gentlemen are considering a partnership between the center and the hospital's Veterans Outreach Program. Mr. Taylor, Dr. Taylor, this is Patricia Miller, one of our most dedicated volunteers." Robert's expression was unreadable, but he nodded politely. "We've met before." Patricia struggled to find her voice. "Yes, we have." An awkward silence fell over the group. Donna, sensing the tension, excused herself to answer a phone call, leaving the three of them alone in the hallway. "I didn't know you volunteered here," Robert said finally. Patricia nodded. "It started as my community service, but I stayed on. The veterans here, they've taught me so much." Dr. Anthony Taylor studied her with the same calm intensity his father possessed. "I heard from my patient, your father, that you've been going through some significant changes." "Yes," Patricia admitted. "It's been a difficult journey, but a necessary one." Robert glanced around at the center. "The director tells me you started a book club for the veterans, that you're helping with job applications, that you've become quite an advocate." Patricia shook her head slightly. "It's nothing compared to." "It's something," Robert interrupted. "Most people would have done the minimum service required and disappeared. You stayed." Patricia met his eyes directly for the first time. "After what I did, how could I not try to be better? To do better." The three stood in silence for a moment. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either, just heavy with shared history and unspoken thoughts. Finally, Robert extended his hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Patricia hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling slightly as they clasped his. "My father taught me something important growing up," Robert said quietly. He said forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about creating space for people to become better versions of themselves. Tears welled in Patricia's eyes. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, Anthony said, stepping forward. But forgiveness isn't about what's deserved. It's about what's needed for healing, for growth, for moving forward. He didn't offer his hand, but his nod acknowledged her humanity in a way Patricia hadn't expected. As they continued their tour, Patricia returned to unpacking supplies, her hands still shaking. The encounter wasn't a neat, happy ending with hugs and instant friendship. There was still discomfort, still pain, still a long road ahead. But in that brief exchange, in Robert's extended hand and Anthony's acknowledging nod, there was something powerful. Something that felt like the first fragile step toward healing. Not forgetting, not erasing, but moving forward with eyes wide open to the truths they had all learned. Patricia picked up a paintbrush and turned it over in her hands, thinking of the veterans who would use it to express their pain, their hopes, their journey toward healing. Perhaps that's what she was doing too, creating something new from the broken pieces of who she used to be.